That'd be good. All right, there we go. Okay, so welcome to Software Saturdays. This is lesson 3 or week 3 here, where we're going to be talking about the basic Vue.js. And in case you needed a refresher, we are here on week 3 of our 7-week curriculum, meaning we have 2 more left, more Vue.js next week, and then NoSQL databases the week after that. And then after that, we'll have our 2 project days to work on our final project for the certification. Okay. And once again, as a reminder to everyone, help-wise, obviously we had the sessions here at 30:30s. We also will be having the recordings on Sundays, as well as the review hours on Wednesdays from 6 to 7. I recommend if you're kind of getting a little bit confused, please go, because we're at the point in the course where we're going to be talking about some more complicated stuff as you move through more and more. All right, this is kind of a stuff we've gone over before. Have a text editor, VS Code, whatever, you guys all already. And also the GitHub is updated with all the code for every lesson we're going to be talking about. All right, so part 1, what is Vue.js, first of all? So Vue.js is a very popular JavaScript library that allows us to create user interfaces and like web apps extremely fast. It is very common, something called a single page application or a web app, and you're probably using these on the daily without even noticing you're actually using them sometimes. So for example, if you ever use a Google Calendar, that's technically a web app, or even like Facebook or Instagram, YouTube's a web app, like all these very popular things that you're using, use something like Vue, maybe React, but nowadays more Vue, to create that user interface. It's easy, it's fast, and it's really simple for the programmer. So Vue has this idea of a shadow DOM. What that means is it has like a copy of the screen in its memory, and what it does is it makes changes to the copy of the screen in your actual memory. If you remember from last week, when we talked about the JavaScript responsiveness, right, with the get element by ID or class names, those change the actual screen. What you'll see here is that what Vue does is it changes its own personal fake copy, we'll call it, and then it'll synchronize those changes with the actual screen every, very kind of short interval, basically. The main reason why it does this is because those changes can be made by the Vue's algorithm, significantly more faster and more efficiently than humans like us or you or whatever could actually possibly make those changes. And so it allows you to kind of modify things much more quicker and with less lines of code than you would normally have to using the regular plain JavaScript we learned last week. So to add Vue to this website is actually really simple. All you have to do is see the script tag right here, just basically copy and paste it into the head section of your website. If you remember in the head section, we have the title and the link for the CSS file. Well, all you're going to do is below that, you would just copy paste this link and your Vue will automatically be added for your web page. You can then actually do stuff with Vue to make your page do something, but for right now, that's what we're going to talk about right here. All right, so there's this idea of declarative rendering. What that means is inside of our JavaScript file, after we've imported Vue, we then have to first define a Vue instance. This tells like the web browser that we want to create Vue, actually use Vue on this page, and we need to tell it where to mount. What that really means is there needs to be a root element, as it's called, or basically like a tag that we mount to that tells Vue, okay, only make your changes to the copy of the page in between these tags. So for example, if you remember how you can have nested tags in HTML, that's the whole reason why we want to do this. Because we only want Vue to modify maybe a small part of our site, not the entire thing. And so we can use Vue to actually make those changes, maybe only in the header or only in the content part and nowhere else. And you'll see that I'm talking about here when we look at the Vue instance in a few slides. Second thing to know about Vue is the idea of mustache formatting. And what that does is you can put a JavaScript variable name in the HTML of your website and surround it by 2 curly braces. And when you do that, Vue will automatically search for those and replace that entire sequence with the value of the JavaScript variable. So you can create like dynamic pages that actually change responding to, user actions or database requests, or even a whole number of things without any kind of extra effort being done by you, the program. So what does that look like? Well, here is like the absolute most basic Vue instance you can possibly create here. So we'll have two sides. The HTML is on the left here, I believe, and the JavaScript on the right. So if you look at the HTML, you'll see that the div tag is acting as our root or base element. Now that's telling Vue that we only want to modify things within this div given with the ID app. The ID can be whatever you want. App is just the most common convention, but obviously, again, as the most things in coding, it's really your preference. But I recommend sticking with something like app to make it more standardized across all kind of everyone's code. Here's a mustache format I talked about earlier. So we have the JavaScript variable, in this case, the JavaScript variable's message, and we surrounded it by two curly braces. And Vue will change that whole thing to be the value of message from our code. Now, if you go back over to our code here on the right, here is our basic Vue instance, as you can see. So we say let app equal new Vue. And that's telling the web browser that we're creating a new Vue instance that we want to run on our web page. The EL there is short for element, as the name might suggest, and the hash app is just letting us know that we want to mount the Vue instance, or basically have it only modify or do Vue stuff to the app ID div, which is again that div. Then there's the idea of this data field here. That is all the JavaScript variables that you want Vue to keep track of, to replace in your code, to use in other parts of the Vue. What else? We'll talk about that more later. But as you can see here, inside this data object, we have the message variable. And it has the value, it's a key value, right? So here's the key message, and the value is hello Vue. And so when you go and look at this page on a website, the message part here will be replaced with hello Vue. And anytime you change the value of message, the web page will be automatically updated. So if you made this like, goodbye, that would automatically update this to goodbye. So maybe as some more data comes in from like a database or some kind of server elsewhere, you can change what the user sees depending upon the JavaScript variables. So we'll kind of walk through a really basic example of what I'm talking about there. So I'm going to move this here so you can see my screen here. So as a reminder, the GitHub code is on GitHub. It's on linked on slide 6 or 7 or something like that. In the demo1 folder, actually, can I open it from here? Let's find out. I don't think I can, but that's all right. We'll just open it manually. All right. Where did you go? Your documents here. Okay. So if you look at our HTML here, you'll see a pretty, let me move you out of the way, sorry. There we go, sorry. So here you can see that script tag I was talking about earlier. Again, you just drop that in the head part of your web page and it'll automatically be imported by the browser for you. No extra work required on your part. Now in the body, you'll see that we have the div tag here, and you still have to have a JavaScript file, in this case I call it my demo1.js, and link it at the bottom of your code. Otherwise, some things may not properly load, so I recommend always loading your own JavaScript at the very end if possible. So we have some p tags in this div. So here's the div, the ID app. Again, apps is a convention, that's not required. And here we have a whole bunch of those p tags I was talking about earlier. So we have this first p tag, which is some nothing, regular old text. And then here's that first example of that mustache formatting we talked about earlier. It's also message, so we might say that in the JavaScript file. But you can have multiple variables, in this case, other message, which will again be replaced with a value of other message. And so if you go to the JavaScript file, you'll see our basic Vue instance that we saw in the example on the slides. And there are two data properties, two data variables. There's message, which is here's a message, and other message, which is, you know, whatever the string is here. And such as if we run this in the web browser, and we'll do that like so. Yeah, here we go. You'll see that there's no that formatting, right? It's just the actual text we had in our JavaScript. And actually, because we have JavaScript variables, you can see a neat property because of by doing this. So if you remember, it's called app, right? Just keep that in mind for right now. If you open up our browser console, which you guys should remember from last week, and we type app.message equals changed text, and we enter, you'll see we actually modified the text in real time. And that was because, again, the Vue library will automatically sync up those changes for you. So in one line, you automatically change that whole line of text. And in fact, we can change the other message too. Other message equals new message, like a new variable. And you can see it automatically syncs that change pretty much instantly after I hit enter. So again, think about how powerful this is. A database request comes back or an API request comes back from, you know, some server elsewhere. In the meantime, you can have like a waiting message. But what the user sees when you actually load the data is the actual, you know, response of that server or that database or the API or whatever you might want to use instantaneously. So are there any questions about this demo here, or the code here? All right, sounds good then. That actually leads us to our first checkpoint, which is just going to be using Vue and trying to figure out how it works on your own. So this is going to be very similar to the demo 1 program, but try to write this whole thing from scratch so that you know how to write Vue without any kind of copy pasting of code. All right, that was a pretty basic idea of what Vue was, right? And what can Vue, the power of Vue, you can kind of see the beginnings of it. But let's go in more detail about that with something called V Directives. So V Directives are really useful for handling and changing HTML. And the V in the V directive or V dash is short for Vue, as you know, because we're using Vue, the library. And so we kind of use these to signify that these are only coming from Vue, because there are other libraries who make changes as well using a similar style, but we only want Vue changes here. So these 5 V directives that you're going to see, actually only 5 you can ever use, and you will definitely use all 5 of these for a lot of projects, are V-Bind, VF, V-Model, V-On, and V4. And using a combination of all 5 of these, you can really do whatever you can imagine somehow by chaining them together, by doing some kind of complicated, you know, events. Really, the sky is the limit. And so this week, we'll go over the first 4. So V-Bind, VF, V-Model, and V-On. And then next week, we'll talk about V4 and a couple more things about Vue. So first up is V-Bind. So V-Bind will, as the name might suggest, bind an HTML attribute to the value of a JavaScript variable. Any HTML attribute can be bound, including like the source for an image, hrefs for like links, titles for images again, heights and widths. Basically, if it's a property you can use, or attribute you can use in HTML, you can bind it in V-Bind. Therefore, if you modify the variable, the attribute will also change. It's a pretty cool part of it as well. So using V-Bind, you just type the V-bind colon before your HTML attribute, and then after that, you put the name of the attribute, equal sign, and then in quotes, where you would normally put the value of the attribute, like the URL for a source tag. You instead put the JavaScript variable name, and Vue will take care of the rest for you. So for example, we have this image tag here, and in the red, you can see we are binding the source. So instead, there should be some URL, right? Some like, you know, .png or JPEG. Instead, we have some data. And in the JavaScript file, some data will be a variable that, equals, I don't know, like image.jpg or whatever we think we might need. And as we change it, it'll automatically change the image to map. It's a pretty cool, hot change feature, which could be very useful for, like an Instagram kind of app. Who knows? Next up is VIF. So VIF will conditionally render something to the screen. What that means is you will check to see if some variable is true or false, and if the variable is false, it'll remove that element and any child or nested elements from the page. And if it is true, it'll re-add them back. So you can have like maybe, I don't know, like an error message only pop up when something goes wrong. Or maybe you can have like an edit box that only appears when you hit a button or something like that. And VIF will actually remove it so you can't even see it on the browser page. To use VIF, it's really simple. You just do VIF =, and then in the quotes, again, like an attribute would, you put the name of a JavaScript variable. And if that variable is true, then the element will be rendered. If it is false, the element will be removed. So here's an example of this little div tag here, and you have a VIF that has should see. And so it should see as true. We will see some text is here. Otherwise, we will not see some text is here. And once again, because Vue is always working in the background, if you ever change the value of should see, it'll automatically reevaluate whether or not it should add or remove that element. All right, number 3. Is it going too fast, or are we doing okay? Okay, cool. The third one is V-Model. So V-Model will track input from a text box and save it to a variable. It's kind of like the idea of controlled input in other JavaScript libraries, but basically any kind of keystroke you type into a text box will automatically sync up with this variable. So the variable is always the exact same as the value of the text. That can be useful, for example, think about it. How many times have you entered text in like a form? You can use that to kind of keep that data safe for processing elsewhere. So to use V-Model, it's really simple. In the input tag, you just do V-Model message, and message can be whatever you want. This is the name of a variable in quotes again. And what happens is any keystroke will be automatically changed to so any input in this little text box here will automatically equal the value of message. And you can actually use this to preload or maybe a text box. Maybe you set message should have some initial value. That means that the user will see that value in the text box at the very start. So again, like a pre-filled out form for like a Java application maybe. All right, let's talk about demo program number 2. All right, so again, I'm going to go to my Notepad++ here, and we are just going to open up demo 2. Okay, so demo 2 is a pretty fancy HTML file. Again, please note we have a script tag here to import Vue, so we know we can use it in our code. And then we have a lot of, kind of fancy stuff. So first note, of course, we have our regular div app, it's called, to make sure that we always want to use Vue only within this div. And then here we test out kind of all of the divs, basically, all the possible kind of V directives. So the first one you can see is this V-Bind. So you can say V-Bind source is this value of image src. VIF is can you see me? You can see some text in the middle here. And finally, we have this V-Model. So again, here's kind of an example of chaining things together to make something more complicated. We have a P tag above the input box, and the value of the P tag is always going to be the value of input message. That means as we type it out, we'll save the changes to the input message variable, and then we will automatically display input message to the user, on the screen. And in the JavaScript, you can imagine here, we have a message, which is just, again, from last time, we have an image src, which just points to this Pokemon sprite from last fall's project. A can you see me, which is true, So we should see a message, and then an input message. So start. And again, how I mentioned you can preload a text box. This is an example of that. Because we told that input message equals start at the very beginning, the user will always see the start text in the input message, because the changes do go both ways. Both the code and the user can make changes to the variables. All right, let's try that out, shall we? All right, first things first. We got a little, little Bulbasaur there, kind of hanging out, and we have the text start, and we can indeed see this text. But watch this. As they begin to type, you will see that it automatically changes above as well. So if I remove some characters, it's still there, and if I add them back, it's right there again. So again, it's kind of chaining two different parts of Vue together to make a more complex Vue action. And you can imagine you might need this sometimes, for example, like a word processor or something like that. Now, I want to show you again how things change on the fly. So I'm just going to copy this link here. We'll go back to our web, close you out. Okay, so if you open up our console, and we run app dot, I believe it was, can you see me? And you make it false instead of true like it was before. Enter. You'll see because that variable is now false, we have now removed that div completely from the page, meaning the user can no longer see it. But if you set it back to true, if I can spell properly, we now add it back to the page. Now, this doesn't have to be just true or false. Again, it's truthy or truth-like. So for example, you can set it to like 1, and that'll still be true, but 0 would be false. It's kind of a weird thing. To reference that, remember, go back to lesson 2, where we talk about JavaScript equality and the kind of things to be careful for, though, when you're doing something like that. And finally, if you look at the app.image source, which was this Bulbasaur, we change it to this other URL I just have. Oops, sorry. Put it in quotes, sorry, it should be in quotes, not just a raw. There we go. You will see it, does it actually load that image? Okay, the link might be bad actually, my bad. But it should load that image if you do it. Yeah, I think the white part might be garbage. Yeah, we redid the file. Oh, there it is. It took a while to load. My bad, sorry, it did work, haha. And you can see once it loaded the image, because it must be a pretty big image apparently, we then modify, make it easy to see here, we then change that Bulbasaur to the Software Society's logo, again, on the fly. So you can have the user always kind of seeing new images depending upon whatever they want to see. Are there any questions with demo program number 2? The idea of using some V directives here. Cool. All right, time for the final V directive we're going to talk about today. That's going to be the V-On Directive. So V-On will handle events like button clicks and amongst other things, but we primarily in this class, for this week at least, will use button clicks. It is kind of like the on-click property, the attribute from buttons last week, if you remember that, right? To call some JavaScript function. Except this time it's controlled by Vue, meaning it'll run some Vue function instead of some regular JavaScript function. And again, like you can imagine, this is very useful if you want your event to change variables or run some other code or kind of react to user interaction. Excuse me. So this is a bit trickier. To use V-On, you have to first type V-On, and then the name of the event you want to handle. So again, for this week, the only event we're really going to talk about is going to be click, right, for a button click. But if you want to look into it, basically any valid JavaScript event will run perfectly fine and be handled by Vue. And actually, next week, we'll see about how you can make your own custom events, maybe. You then, in the, kind of like last week, in the quotes after the equal sign, you put the name of the function you want to run whenever that event is triggered. So in this example, V-On click means we want to run the method name function. One thing to note, which is a little bit tricky, is that functions must be defined in a separate part of the Vue instance. So far we saw the EL, which is the name of the root element you want to mount to. We saw data, which is all the data fields for, V-Bind and, the V-On and all that kind of stuff. Now we'll talk about the methods fields, which leads us into part 3, which is the Vue instance. This code is a little bit complicated and kind of a little too commented, but it should give you an example of all of the main ideas of what is called the Vue instance. So the Vue instance is kind of like all of the parameters and all of the options you want Vue to do and modify and change and handle in your library, in your code. So we for sure saw the first two. The EL, again, tells the JavaScript where you want to mount your Vue instance to. And data is all of the variables you want to format or bind or display for the user. Now, here's the next two you haven't seen before, but will be useful. Methods and computing. Methods are going to be the methods you use for event handlers. So in this case, we have a function called setToggle, and it's a function that just makes toggle inverted. So it'll go back and forth between true and false every button click, for example. Now, a few things to note that can be tricky, especially if you're not used to seeing some Vue code, is all of these sections are technically JavaScript objects, if you can kind of see that right here. So for example, data, if you look at it, right, it's a key, colon, and then a value, right? The value being an object, so it's actually another object, actually, if I'm being more fancy about it. And the data object is, again, key, colon, and then values. Methods are very similar. Methods is a key where the value is an object containing a list of more objects. In this case, the key being setToggle and the value being this function. So you can kind of see how the idea of nesting objects within one another is really useful in all kinds of programming. And so you can have as many methods as you want, as long as you put a comma after that trailing curly brace right there. Now, the last part is probably one of the more confusing aspects of Vue, and that is the computed field. So that a computed variable is a variable whose value depends on something from the data fields, but isn't exactly going to always be kind of some single value. This is kind of like basically a method that references data fields and will return a value that kind of links these data fields together in interesting ways. So a very, very basic example of this is this variable. We'll call it a variable. It's not really, but for now we will. Called otherToggle. And again, because a computed property must be a function that returns something, it just returns the opposite of toggle. Now, this isn't a very useful example, as you can probably see. Why would you want to ever do that? But what it is an example of how otherToggle depends on the value of depends on the value of toggle. So whenever toggle changes, Vue will automatically update otherToggle to match the new value, recompute the properties, so to speak, of otherToggle. An example of this being very useful is if you want to have some kind of error checking, that checks for like a whole lot of other properties. Like for example, is the text field blank? Is a user logged in? I don't know. Is the password formatted properly? You can use a computed property to check all of that and then return a single, yes error, no error kind of true or false value. For example, there's so many things you could do with computed properties, but they can be kind of confusing if you're not, too familiar with them at first. All right. Does everyone kind of get the basic Vue instance here? Yes, question. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, my bad, sorry. Okay, so yeah, I should probably mention that first. So if you notice in the method and in the otherToggle functions, we use the word this dot in the variable name. If you ever take in an object-oriented language like Java or C++ or Python, you'll kind of get the idea of a global variable, right? Or like a class-based variable. If you're not, don't worry about it too much. but just know that inside of Vue, if you want to reference a data field from somewhere else inside your code, you have to put the word this dot in the variable name, so Vue knows you're talking about the Vue data field. Reason for that is in the function here, like set toggle, you can have another variable called toggle. It's local to the function, meaning the variable only exists within the function. However, we want to talk about the global or the big Vue toggle. So we're saying this toggle or Vue's toggle, so to speak. It's kind of like the self keyword in Python or like the this keyword in, again, C++ and Java. That answer your question? Sort of?
Visually, I was gonna say visually it might help if you look at brackets too. Like if you know the toggle variables like in between brackets, and then it's like there's the brackets and close it. Then you open new brackets in order to get back to a different, in order to get access to variables in a different set of brackets. Essentially, you need this to tell it that you have to look outside of just the brackets that you're writing in.
What happens if you have another object that is called toggle to in another object? I mean, another variable for toggle in another object, then does this refer to the?
By another object, you mean another Vue instance?
So if there is two toggles.
Yeah, that could be.
Oh, like one in data and like one in, say, computed?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll cause an error.
Yeah, you don't want
That'll
to
be
do
an
that.
error for sure, yeah. So the question was, like, if you have two toggles, for example, right? One in data, one in computed. I've never tried that. I feel like it would either cause an error or you'd have very buggy behavior. So I'll recommend just keeping things unique in case something like that ever happens.
You could do it in methods though, right? You could have toggle variable in methods because if you use this dot.
Yeah, so in the set toggle function, there can be a local toggle value that is different from the, like, we'll call it the Vue toggle variable.
But practically, it's just easier to use different things. It like when in doubt, just use a different.
Yeah.
It makes life easier.
Yeah, always name things well because they'll come back to bite you if you don't.
Yeah, name things very well.
Was that any questions online? Same thing. Any questions? Yeah. All right. Cool. It is quickly time for demo 3 now, which is going to be just kind of using some more Vue stuff. All right. Let's open up my demo 3. All right, so demo 3 here, look at the HTML. I'm just gonna close this out. It's gonna look very similar. Oh, this is the wrong file again, my goodness. It's gonna look pretty similar to demo 2. And now we kind of use a combination of different Vue properties to kind of do some pretty interesting things. So we have our regular old div to kind of represent our basic Vue instance. And then we have two divs here, VF, and then this second VF, which is, so the two VFs are bound to different things, for example. This first VF goes to toggle, and then the second VF, as you can see, is other toggle. And then finally, on the very bottom, we have a button here that says, that has a V-On for a click, going to set toggle. You'll see some other things here, just ignore them for now. We'll maybe talk about that. It's a bit more advanced Vue stuff if you want to learn more about how to do that. So we can see we have toggle being true, and other toggle here is returning the opposite of toggle. Like I said, it's not a very useful example of a computer property, but it is an example of a computer property. Okay, and actually I'm just gonna do a quick comment job on this because that might just confuse you guys. Yeah, there we go, sorry. And you can see the set toggle function just returns the opposite toggle, meaning it'll kind of toggle this, random variable back and forth. So if we just do a quick run on our code, that was the wrong code. Whoops. The demo 3 code. Okay. Okay. And if you see nothing going wrong, take a look right here. There's probably an error somewhere. In this case, I have some error in my code when I commented the wrong thing out. So just to fix that, we'll just and we should be good now. Go back to Edge, and we will refresh the page. Okay, so you can see we have some kind of, we have a little div here. It says, now you can see me. And if we toggle it, you can see it goes between two different, VIFs, right? Because toggle was true, but other toggle is false, meaning we'll only ever see one of the two VIFs at a time. And so you can kind of scroll back and forth and kind of, have fun time, look at your VIFs there. Does that make sense? Yeah, cool. And if you want to look at this code and GitHub a bit more, there is some fancier thing here with this second function. If you can kind of see that, and I removed one of the things from here. But you can kind of, again, do some pretty cool things with VIFs and, V-binds. That if you want to get into a checkpoint, you can maybe, ask about the GitHub an example how to do that. Okie dokie. So yeah, today's a pretty short lesson because we don't really have a whole lot to cover, unfortunately, this first week. I'm going to keep it kind of work your way into Vue because it can be pretty complicated getting into the first time. So if you want to read ahead, I recommend please read the guide. The link is right over here. It is a very well written and very good guide. Actually, a lot of our examples are going to kind of come from this guide because it's easy to read, even if you don't already know too much about programming in JavaScript. But we'll kind of cover most of the introduction of this guide this next 2 weeks in class. So checkpoint number 2, I kind of hinted at, I'll come back to it though, is a checkpoint for the first part, I guess, is to please give us some feedback. I know there are not too many people here, but we would appreciate any kind of advice you have on how to improve lectures or change or what to keep. And as a reminder, office hours are every Wednesday from 6 to 7 p.m. on Zoom. The link is always in the fall 2021 Vue.js channel, posted by one of our mentors, a few minutes before we open up the room. Okay, so checkpoint number 2 is to combine V directives together for more complex actions. What that means is, can you basically do things, right? And if you want to see an example of that, look at the GitHub checkpoint example. But for example, if you remember that V-Model kind of changing that text above it, something like that. How can you use multiple V directives to do something pretty interesting and see what you can come up with?